Old Country Buffet was a popular restaurant chain found mostly throughout the Midwestern part of the United States, and a lot of people, including myself, have good memories eating there. Let me know if you're the same way, but when I was younger, the part that always stood out to me was all the dessert options. They would have a bunch of tiny plates with these cube-shaped slices of cake that you could just grab, and boy did I grab them. Thanksgiving meals and trips to Old Country Buffet as a child are probably the fullest I have ever been in my life. I get happy just thinking about that place, and I continued to go there until it wasn't an option anymore. See, that's the thing. Old Country Buffet no longer exists, and as far as I could tell, there are 0 locations in operation, and it's looking unlikely that will change anytime soon. Would you even believe me if I were to tell you that the parent company of Old Country Buffet has filed for bankruptcy 3 times? Well, that would be inaccurate because it's actually been 4 times, which I believe is more than any other company I've covered on this channel. It happened in 2008, 2012, 2016, and 2021, coincidentally coinciding with the Summer Olympic years. Holy cow, I'm trying to make light of the situation because it's upsetting. It has been a long, drawn-out decline that has left a lot of people wondering what happened. Viewers have been leaving comments on my channel for years now, requesting that I make this video explaining why America's once largest buffet chain has completely shut down. It is a significant story that heavily ties into some other major buffet chains, like Hometown Buffet and Ryan's. All of them are gone, and I'm going to do my best to explain why by outlining what I believe to be 5 of the biggest reasons behind their decline. But first, let me take a little bit of time to explain why they were so successful in the first place. In 1983, Roe Hatlin and Dennis Scott came together to co-found Old Country Buffet. They both had experience in the restaurant industry, having been important figures at a different chain called King's Table, so they were able to use their reputation and connections to raise enough capital from investors to open the first ever Old Country Buffet in early 1984, and it was almost an instant success. Sales for that first year were almost double their expectations, and it grew quickly. By the end of that decade, it was a publicly traded company with 70 restaurants generating over $100 million in sales each year. And they were so successful because in a lot of ways, they stood out from most of the other cafeterias and buffet chains. Some of the bigger differences would be the fact that it was all-inclusive, meaning you pay once when you walk in and get access to everything, including the beverages, the salad, and those delicious desserts, as opposed to paying for each item individually. The food was cooked in small batches, as opposed to cooking a bunch of it ahead of time, and that helped ensure that the food was always hot and fresh, and gave it a higher quality appearance. Finally, the scatter bar format, as they call it. In 1989, they started putting the food out at different islands scattered around, as opposed to the traditional straight line format that was being used by practically everyone else at the time. The advantage there is that people can get to the food easier and typically don't have to wait in line for it. Throughout the 1990s, everyone else started adapting that same format. They say that it had a 17% compound annual growth rate throughout that time. These are all things that most of us probably don't think too much about when we're there, but Old Country Buffet kind of helped evolve the format, and they had a lot of success because of it. If I had to pick out a single year as being their absolute peak, when they were at their biggest and most promising, right before things started to go downhill, I would say that year is 2000. They were the biggest buffet in the country, claiming to hold a 22% share of the market, making them almost twice as big as anyone else, and maybe even more impressively, they were on a streak of 12 consecutive quarters of same-store sales growth, basically meaning that they were getting more and more traffic in the restaurants. And the reason that I say that this was a turning point for them leads me to the first reason on my list: a leveraged buyout. I know that viewers of this channel get concerned whenever I say those words, and here it is a perfect example why. In the year 2000, the executives at Old Country Buffet felt that the company was doing much better than the stock price reflected. When you see something being sold for less than you think it's worth, it might be smart to buy it, right? And that is exactly what they did. They brought together these New York-based private equity firms, borrowed a bunch of money, and paid more than $650 million to buy the company from the public and take it off the stock market. Prior to the deal, the company held something like $40 million in debt, and after the deal, it was over $400 million. Significantly higher, but likely still manageable if the company were able to continue growing and live up to those high expectations. Well, I'm sure you could see where this is going. In the following years, for multiple reasons, people weren't going to the Old Country Buffet nearly as often, and sales fell. Profits weren't as strong as they needed to be to comfortably cover those interest payments. They started closing some of the worst performing restaurants as a way to limit the losses and become more efficient, but you can't really downsize too far when you're still responsible for paying back $400 million. In short, the buyout put them in a risky position and turned out to be a gamble that didn't pay off. By 2006, those private equity firms were thinking about selling the concept before an opportunity presented itself that led them down a much different path, and that leads me to the next reason on my list: overextending. This right here is almost a continuation of the first reason, but there are so many more layers to it, much like the lasagna at Old Country Buffet that unfortunately, no, I don't recall trying and probably never will at this point. Let me take a step back for a minute. From the beginning, the leaders behind Old Country Buffet have been aggressive in expanding the concept. What started as one restaurant in a strip mall in the outer part of Minneapolis took only 6 years to become a sizable chain that was spending millions of dollars to acquire their competitors. Notably, in 1996, they spent almost $200 million to buy a chain of almost 100 restaurants called Hometown Buffet. It was partially funded by debt and complicated things a bit, but overall, it was a logical acquisition. See, 5 years earlier, Dennis Scott, co-founder of Old Country Buffet, had left the company to start a new buffet concept in San Diego that was called Hometown Buffet. Used that same scatter bar format and served similar food, so it was almost a perfect way to join the co-founders back together and expand their presence into the West Coast. The customers were there, it was a perfect fit, the timing was right with everything on the upswing, and they had the money to make it happen, so overall, I would call it a successful deal. Now, a decade later, they made a much less successful deal. When everything was going south and they were considering selling the company, things were also starting to go south for another major buffet concept called Ryan's. The owner of Ryan's expressed interest in selling it, so the owner of Old Country Buffet took the opportunity to buy it. The reasoning behind the decision is that there is strength in numbers. Scaling the business would theoretically lead to savings, and plus Ryan's was considered a southern chain based in South Carolina, so there was very little geographic overlap between the three chains. It was kind of like a cool opportunity to become this super chain of buffets with 675 restaurants across the country, Hometown along the West Coast, Old Country in the Midwest, and now Ryan's in the South. But unlike before, it wasn't great timing. It was a struggling chain buying another struggling chain. It wasn't a perfect fit because there was no prior association between them, and Ryan's had much more emphasis on steak and grilling. But most importantly, this time Old Country Buffet didn't really have the money to do it, and they paid a lot of money for it. They bought Ryan's at an almost 50% premium over its trading price, and a lot of it was funded by debt. By the end of it, they owed $800 million that, again, they really could not afford to pay. The following year, that combined company had sales of almost $1.4 billion that, partially because of such high debt payments, they ended up losing over $100 million from it. Next up on my list is external factors, and I'm mainly talking about the economy here. People not having much money to spend on the all-you-can-eat dining experience has been a huge factor in reduced traffic and lower sales. It was already affecting Ryan's and Old Country Buffet individually, and really got out of hand when they took on more debt to combine forces right when the economy was entering its worst period. They filed for bankruptcy for the first time in 2008, reporting debt of $1.2 billion compared to less than $1 billion in assets. They cited external economic factors as the main source behind their trouble, and from there, it has all been a mess. Filing for bankruptcy every 4 to 5 years, closing restaurants, trying to become more efficient and reducing debt every time, but obviously never fully recovering to a stable position. Another external factor outside of the economy that has hurt them is the pandemic. Most restaurants were impacted by it, but buffets even more so. It's more of a communal dining experience that doesn't translate easily into drive-thru or curbside pickup. I honestly don't want to put too much blame on the pandemic in this case, considering they were greatly reduced and had already filed for bankruptcy 3 times before it started, but it was a big factor behind their 4th bankruptcy, as crazy as that sounds, but they would still likely have a small presence otherwise. My next reason behind the decline is changing owners. I don't have too much to say about this one, but going through bankruptcy and getting new owners so many times is hectic. Different people with new ideas and conflicting visions trying to implement new strategies every few years can be counterproductive. It's to a point where I don't even think it would be valuable to go through each one of them and talk about the changes, because all of them have been short-lived and clearly none of them have been effective enough to slow down that downward momentum. I do want to mention that one of the owners was sued by this guy, Chris Gage, after he had been exposed to salmonella at an Old Country Buffet in Cheyenne, Wyoming. It really is a troubling story. He had a pre-existing condition that was addressed years earlier, and he was asymptomatic until the exposure, and that just led to horrible, debilitating problems. In the end, no one even showed up in court to represent Old Country Buffet, and it led to an $11.4 million judgment against them that was mentioned as a reason behind their 2016 bankruptcy. I don't know, it's just an example of a high payment and a bad situation that seems like it could have been easily avoided and wasn't handled very well. My final reason behind the decline is maybe the most obvious one: becoming outdated, and there's a few different ways you could look at this, one of them being the food itself. From the beginning, the menu at Old Country Buffet was based on traditional home-cooked meals, fried chicken and mashed potatoes, things along those lines that probably don't have the greatest health content. As people have become more conscious about their health and their diet, we can theorize that eating large amounts of seemingly unhealthy food has become less attractive to the average consumer. I mean, buffets in general have struggled. I've made multiple videos on this channel about failed buffet chains already, and there's probably more to come. Part of that is likely due to a decline in casual dining. Fast casual restaurants have become so much more popular since Old Country Buffet and all the others were at their peak, and so has home delivery. People are eating at home today way more compared to the 1990s. Overall, Old Country Buffet, I think anyway, was a concept that was much more attractive to an older generation. In fact, if you look them up on the internet, the most common result you will find today is an awkward training video that I have to think is probably the only exposure that many younger people have had to the restaurant. And most of the awkwardness of it stems from this guy who works there trying to make conversation with the customers.
Have you tried the lasagna? It's my favorite.
Which is fine and almost certainly not nearly as awkward in real life as the video portrays it, but still, friendliness and conversation like that seems to be something that was so much more valued by older generations. Believe it or not, I have not even gotten to the most depressing part yet. In 2021, Old Country Buffet and the other buffet brands were acquired by BBQ Holdings, the parent company of a barbecue restaurant chain called Famous Dave's. Back in 1999, Old Country Buffet had bought a small chain of California steakhouses called Tahoe Joe's, and ever since it has remained an almost insignificant part of the company. Well, BBQ Holdings bought all of it as a package deal through the bankruptcy court for $4.7 million only because they wanted those steakhouses to complement their existing ones. Their CEO says he has no plans on reopening Old Country Buffet or any of the others. They just sort of came along with the deal. It is so crazy to think that this billion-dollar business that so many of us have great memories attached to has been reduced to something so small that it was bought by someone who did not even want it. Let me know in the comments, have you been to Old Country Buffet, and if so, what do you remember most about them? Or maybe you're more familiar with Hometown Buffet or Ryan's, and if so, tell me about your experiences there. Unfortunately, it seems like the book may be closed on all of these chains, so we need to talk about them here to keep the memories alive and documented. All I'm saying here is it would be unfortunate if that training video ends up being their legacy. Enough time has passed to where at this point, I'm going to guess that a lot of the viewers here are more familiar with the Golden Corral, given it's the new biggest buffet chain in the country. Please let me know if you want to see a separate video about them, but I will say right now that they have been so much more successful over the past 25 years because they avoided most of these issues. They have been more proactive in adapting. For example, they didn't even start out as a buffet and have made major changes since. They have been more conservative and managed debt much better. They have had much more consistent leadership. In fact, the founder is still involved with the company. It's just a quick explanation as to why such seemingly similar restaurants have had such different results. Alright, this video is turning out to be a long one, so any thoughts you have about Old Country Buffet or Hometown Buffet or Ryan's Buffet or any other buffet, I've said that word over 40 times now, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.